There is a massive myth today that eating cholesterol from animal products like red meat, butter, egg yolks, and more are going to clog your arteries and give you heart disease. But in this episode today, I'm gonna be breaking this all down for you. I'm gonna be talking about the history of cholesterol consumption, all the faulty science that went into this topic that was done throughout the 1900s, the benefits of cholesterol consumption, and why eating low cholesterol foods and going cholesterol free might just be a terrible idea for your future health and set you up for future chronic disease. So jumping into this discussion of dietary cholesterol, is eating dietary cholesterol going to clog my arteries? It makes sense, doesn't it? If you eat cholesterol, that should be the same cholesterol that's in your arteries. That's how that should work, right? Well, biochemistry doesn't work that way. The cholesterol that you eat from food is not the same cholesterol that's going to be present in your arteries. Here's the thing. If you just eat less cholesterol, your own liver is going to make more of that. It's an essential nutrient that your body needs to thrive. So reeling this back in, when did we in America, in the Western world, really begin associating that cholesterol had something to do with heart disease to begin with? When was that? Before the year 1900, heart disease was relatively rare. It was fairly non-existent. However, there were some pretty one-off instances where heart disease did start to appear, and the first ever recorded instance of heart disease was with the ancient Egyptians. This is over 3,000 years ago in the year 1203 BCE. Researchers found that these ancient Egyptians, they studied 16 different mummies and found that 9 out of the 16 also had evidence of heart disease. Now, it's not entirely sure why they developed heart disease, but it is interesting to note that they are one of the only cultures before our civilized Western society that had started consuming seed oils. There's just a little bit of association correlation there. I just want to leave that there as we move forward talking about some of the science to come, but it's pretty safe to say that heart disease was all but rare until about the 20th century in the 1900s. Heart disease wasn't at epidemic proportions like it is today. Even one of the founding professors of Johns Hopkins Hospital, William Osler, he didn't report any cases of heart disease during his work in the 1870s and 1880s. So either he just really missed it or there really wasn't any heart disease. Now, with that kind of line of thinking, one common objection that I do hear often is that our ancestors didn't live long enough to get heart disease. Their average lifespan was 30 to 40 years old. So if they lived beyond that, then they were going to develop heart disease. But this is just not true. By the year 1900, not that long ago, about 1/5 of the total US population was over 50 years old, which means there were over tens of millions of Americans over prime heart attack age that simply didn't suffer from heart attacks. So why all of a sudden did humans just start getting heart attacks to epidemic proportions? So for all of human history before the 1900s, virtually all the fats that humans had access to were animal fats like butter, lard, tallow, ghee, and then in some more subtropical climates, they had olive oil and coconut oil. They didn't really have access to industrially processed grain and seed oils like canola, corn, cottonseed, sunflower, soybean, safflower, grapeseed, peanut oils. They just didn't have access to these. Now, contrary to popular belief, many health professionals out there will tell you heart disease began skyrocketing in the 1900s because we were eating more meat. This is just simply not true. Because there was data that came from the USDA and NHANES research. They conducted a survey and they found that in the year 1800, humans were consuming on average about 225 pounds of meat, of red meat, per person every single year. Think about that, 225 pounds of red meat per person every single year. This number of red meat slowly and steadily decreased until the year 1900, when humans were consuming roughly 125 pounds of red meat every single year. That was nearly cut in half. In 2007, humans are still consuming roughly about 125 pounds of red meat per person every single year. Red meat continues to fall, but heart disease continues to rise. That doesn't make any logical sense. Well, the science I'm about to lay out today will explain why that makes perfect sense. So in regards to dietary cholesterol, in the late 1800s, this is when researchers began hypothesizing that cholesterol in general just had something to do with clogged arteries. They would perform autopsies and they would find cholesterol plaques in people's arteries when they suffered a heart attack. So again, just logically thinking, cholesterol inside your arteries, if I eat that cholesterol, that's going to be the same cholesterol in my arteries. That's when they started making that association. Now, at this point in time, there wasn't an American Heart Association, there wasn't an NIH, there wasn't a USDA, there weren't all these government agencies in place that were really putting out guidelines. There was nothing like that. There was really no formal scientific evidence. Now, also at this time in the late 1800s, there was a small amount of children that had an abnormally high amount of circulating blood cholesterol, so total blood cholesterol, and they were also at an extremely higher risk of dying from heart disease. So these researchers at that time, they just made the association that because this small subset of children has higher total cholesterol and they are more likely to die of heart disease, then this must be causal. Well, it turns out that this small subset of children had a very rare genetic condition that predisposed them to heart disease. It had nothing to do with their diet. Now, because heart disease was becoming a little bit more and more prevalent, not just nationwide, but worldwide, in the year 1912, a Russian pathologist wanted to find out if eating dietary cholesterol was the cause of cholesterol in the arteries. So what he did, he decided to feed rabbits a diet that was extremely high in cholesterol. And what he found is they developed plaques inside their arteries. So case closed, right? Well, not so fast. Rabbits are herbivores. Their digestive tract is different than humans. When this study was replicated multiple times over, it was replicated in wolves, in dogs, and even in humans. And what was found is that they didn't develop any plaque inside of their arteries because our digestive tracts are much more similar to dogs and wolves than they are an herbivore like a rabbit. And because heart disease kept continuing to climb, this model stuck and it just made logical sense for the population. If I eat cholesterol, it's gonna be the cholesterol inside my arteries. Now, it's also worth noting at this point in time, in the early 1900s, the 1910s, the 1920s, a plant-based diet was really being pushed into culture by none other than John Harvey Kellogg. Yes, the guy that created cereal. He created cereal, Kellogg cereal, not because of any health reasons, but it was because of religious reasons and to prevent people from masturbating, to make people sterile. There is a lot of messed up things that he was doing to push his religious beliefs into culture. Highly recommend checking out that. So there was a lot of programming going on into the American mind to eat a more plant-based diet at this point in time. Not to mention, Procter & Gamble had just come out with their cookbook, The Story of Crisco. Crisco had just made an appearance. This is hydrogenated seed oils. All of these things were taking place at this point in the early 1900s. Coca-Cola had just made an appearance and sugar consumption had skyrocketed. So all of this is taking place within just 20 to 30 years in the early 1900s. And at this point, by 1921, heart disease had just been listed as the #1 cause of death in Americans. So it was virtually non-existent before the year 1900. But then all of a sudden in 1921, it's the leading cause of death, killing hundreds of thousands of Americans, mainly middle-aged men. So this rabbit model continued to stick. And by the 1950s, many researchers believed that having high total cholesterol was the primary cause for heart disease. So they started advocating for diets that would lower total cholesterol levels, which many doctors still do today. However, even Ancel Keys himself, he's the leader of the diet heart hypothesis. He's the reason that people believe that saturated fat is bad, that eating red meat is bad. Even he said in the 1950s that eating dietary cholesterol is basically meaningless. In 1952, he conducted a study on human participants in which he fed them upwards of 3,000 milligrams of cholesterol per day. He found that no matter how much cholesterol he fed them, their total cholesterol numbers remained the same. Just for context, a single egg has about 200 milligrams of cholesterol. So he was feeding them the equivalent of 15 eggs per day, and he found that their cholesterol levels, their total cholesterol, remained unchanged. Now, as a quick side note, I'm just referring to total cholesterol throughout this video. I'm not talking about LDL or HDL because these aren't cholesterol. People might say you're good cholesterol or you're bad cholesterol, but HDL and LDL, this stands for low density lipoprotein or high density lipoprotein. Nowhere in there did I say cholesterol. These are cholesterol carriers. Now, eggs and saturated fat do adjust your HDL and LDL numbers, But what I'm just referring to here is your total cholesterol number. We'll do many more videos breaking down saturated fat, LDL and HDL in videos to come. But for today, we're just talking about dietary cholesterol and your overall cholesterol numbers. Now, this is where the story gets really wild. So as we progress throughout the 1900s, by the year 1961, there was a ton of pressure on the American Heart Association and other governmental agencies to address the growing heart disease epidemic. It was still a #1 killer. Stroke was a #2 killer closely behind. And at this point in 1961, Ancel Keys, he joined the American Heart Association Nutrition Committee, and he joined the NIH, the National Institute of Health panel, and he also appeared on the cover of Time magazine. Now, he was very prominent in pushing forward saturated fat is bad and to reduce your consumption of red meat and other animal products because it raised your total cholesterol. Now, here's where it gets a little messed up. So in this year, 1961, the AHA, the American Heart Association, released a formal statement that said, quote, "The best evidence available suggests that Americans could reduce their risk of heart attacks and strokes by cutting the saturated fat and cholesterol in their diets." And they also went on to say to replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats like corn and soybean oil. Now, they said the best evidence available. Remember that as we move forward. There was a lot of science being done at this point in time. Keys had launched his 6-country study and 7-country study. The American Heart Association was conducting some science, but to be sure, they wanted to begin planning the biggest study ever tested on the diet heart hypothesis. So what they did was they developed the National Diet Heart Study. Now, this study was funded and it was led and conducted by many big food companies. How was this even legal? These companies included the vegetable oil giant at the time, Anderson, Clayton and Company, Carnation, the Corn Products Company, Frito-Lay, General Mills, Heinz, the Pacific Vegetable Oil Corporation, Pillsbury, Quaker Oats, and more. This study, the National Diet Heart Study, it ended up being a huge failure because a quarter of the men couldn't stick to the diet. They dropped out. They didn't want to follow the diet plan. So the study was never completed. They just didn't finish it. It was a huge waste of time, energy, resources, and money. So fast forward a decade. In the year 1971, Keys, the American Heart Association, and the NIH wanted to conduct 2 smaller studies in replace of this failed study that they had just tried to conduct. Well, what they decided to do was to invest $250 million into these 2 separate smaller studies. They thought this was going to be the nail in the coffin, that they were going to walk away from these studies showing that the diet heart hypothesis, the more saturated fat, the more cholesterol you eat, the more your risk of heart disease goes up. Well, wait until you see what the results of these studies were. The very first study they conducted was called the Mr. Fit Trial. This stands for Multiple Risk Factor Intervention Trial. This was conducted from 1973 to 1982. This ran for 9 years. This is the biggest and most demanding medical experiment ever performed, involving 28 different medical centers across the country, and it costed them $115 million to conduct. So what they did was they measured the cholesterol of 361,000 middle-aged men, and they found that 12,000 of them had cholesterol levels above 290 milligrams per deciliter. This is what your doctor would say is really high total cholesterol. Most of them were obese, they had high blood pressure, and they smoked. So they were prime candidates for having a heart attack or getting heart disease. The researchers gave them interventions to eat low fat, eat low cholesterol, drink skim milk, use margarine, limit eggs to less than 2 per week, and avoid meat and desserts. The other half of the men were told to eat and live however they liked. They were the control group. What the researchers found was staggering, that despite the intervention group, the group that had lowered their fat, lowered their cholesterol, despite them successfully changing their diets, they quit smoking, and they reduced their blood pressure, they died more than the control group who lived however they wanted. That is surprising. And then at the 16-year follow-up, this study was followed up again in 16 years in the year 1997. The treatment group, the group that had low fat, ate low cholesterol, they were found to have higher rates of lung cancer. Even though 21% of them had quit smoking, they lowered their total cholesterol, they lowered their blood pressure, they quit smoking, they improved their lifestyle, but yet at the 16-year follow-up, they had more cancer than the group who just lived however they wanted. Well, before this study, before the Mr. Fit trial, there have been dozens of studies showing that lower total cholesterol leads to higher rates of cancer and stroke in humans. They didn't want to know about these studies, or they just chose to ignore them. There was even a study done in rats. When rats were given corn oil, it doubled the rates of tumor. This was done in 1968, 5 years before the Mr. Fit trial was conducted. But there was also dozens of other studies in humans done before this study was conducted that showed that if you lower your total cholesterol using seed oils, then you have a higher risk of getting cancer and stroke. There was even a study conducted by NIH investigators, and it found that Japanese people with cholesterol levels below 180 milligrams a deciliter, that would be considered healthy by most health professionals today. Japanese people with cholesterol levels below 180 milligrams a deciliter suffered stroke at 2 to 3 times higher than those with higher cholesterol levels. Keep all this in mind as we move forward. I'm going to talk more about this to come. And we're going to learn about why lowering your total cholesterol might not necessarily be a good thing. Now, that second study, you remember how I said that they broke up this massive study into 2 separate studies? The first one was the Mr. Fit trial. Now, the second study was called the LRC trial, where they spent $150 million on this. This study was the largest ever experiment to test the idea that lowering one's cholesterol could protect against heart disease. And because the Mr. Fit trial ended up being a pretty big disappointment, the researchers were really hopeful that this one was going to be a lot better. They screened nearly 500,000 middle-aged men, and they found 3,800 with levels of cholesterol high enough to be considered to have a heart attack soon. Their cholesterol levels were above 265 milligrams a deciliter. These 3,800 individuals were divided into 2 different groups, and both groups received counseling to lower their cholesterol in their diet, meaning to eat fewer eggs, eat leaner meats, and lower their dairy fat consumption. The intervention group also received a cholesterol-lowering drug, while the control group received a placebo. So what did the researchers find at the end of this study? The intervention group that was given the drug did lower their cholesterol, but total mortality for both groups was the same. However, this is where it got really interesting for this study. The intervention group that ate a low cholesterol diet and took the cholesterol lowering drug, they died at far higher rates of suicide. And there is a ton of evidence linking lower cholesterol levels to higher rates of depression, suicide, anxiety, and other mental disorders. There was even a meta-analysis of 6 cholesterol-lowering trials that found the chance of dying from suicide or violence was twice as high in the treatment groups as it was in the control groups. What would the reasoning be behind this? Well, the authors noted that when your brain is depleted of cholesterol, it may lead to impaired functioning of serotonin receptors. Serotonin is one of your feel-good hormones. And because your brain is the source of the most cholesterol in your body, if your brain isn't getting enough cholesterol, then that could mean serious consequences for your mental health and stability. Now, staying in this decade of the 1970s, the American Heart Association, NIH, Ancestral, all these researchers are trying to conduct studies that would be the nail in the coffin to prove that the diet heart hypothesis is correct. Well, one of those studies that was conducted is the Minnesota Coronary Survey. This is the largest ever randomized controlled trial on the diet heart hypothesis. This isn't an association, this isn't observational, this is an intervention was given, and this one thing can prove if it caused an outcome or not. So what researchers did was they gathered 9,000 men and women in 6 different Minnesota state hospitals and 1 nursing home, and this study lasted for 4.5 years. 9,000 men and women in a randomized controlled trial is a lot. This doesn't happen in nutrition research. And it should be noted that this can't really be done today due to ethical reasons. So this is one of the best studies, if not the best study, showing if cholesterol saturated fat causes heart disease. Because they sourced their 9,000 men and women from hospitals and nursing homes, this was a very well documented and controlled study. They could control for virtually every factor that was going on in their lives. They knew exactly what foods they were getting, when they were getting it. And the researchers reported a 100% partition rate. Nobody dropped out of this study. What they did was they divided these 9,000 men and women into 2 separate groups. One group was fed traditional American food with at least 18% saturated fat and cholesterol in their diet. The other group got soft margarine, so seed oils, in place of their butter, whole egg substitute, low-fat beef, and dairy products filled with seed oils. You can pretty much think of Oatly with the canola oil in the plant-based milk. Here's the thing, both diets had the same amount of total fat. Total fat in their diet, a certain percentage came from fat. But the intervention group had half the amount of saturated fat and limited their cholesterol. What the authors found when they concluded this 4.5-year randomized controlled trial was that there were absolutely no differences between the two groups for cardiovascular events, cardiovascular deaths, or total mortality. It didn't make a difference. But one thing that they noted was that cancer was a lot higher in the low fat group. And maybe most interestingly and kind of sinister is that this study was completed in 1973, but it wasn't published until 16 years later in a relatively unknown medical journal where the authors knew nobody would find it. So they just hid it. They couldn't undo it. It didn't go the way they wanted, so they just hid the science. That's not what good researchers do. Now, remember a little bit earlier in this video when I mentioned that the American Heart Association said in 1961, before these studies were conducted, they said, quote, "The best evidence available suggests that Americans should reduce their risk of heart attacks and strokes by cutting the saturated fat and cholesterol in their diets." Well, they said the best evidence available. Well, now they had more evidence showing that reducing meat, reducing dietary cholesterol, reducing saturated fat, it didn't work, and it actually potentially increased their risk of getting cancer. Fast forward after these studies were conducted by the American Heart Association, in 1977 now, the American Heart Association, unfortunately, went on to release their dietary goals. This was virtually the first official report anywhere in the world advising Americans to eat lean meats, limit saturated fat, limit dietary cholesterol, lower salt consumption, and increase carbohydrate consumption to 60% of total calories. Because at this point in time, the American Heart Association was the leading authority on heart prevention, heart protection, heart health. They were very pressured to get information out to the public because heart disease was a #1 killer, strokes was a second #2 killer. They had to get their recommendations out to the public because in 1969, President Eisenhower had just died from a heart attack, and heart disease was the #1 killer, killing hundreds of thousands of Americans at this point. And they said the best available evidence that they had was to limit saturated fat, lower cholesterol, and increase more plants in your diet. And since the American Heart Association released their report in 1977, now Congress had to get involved. The American government had to get involved. So what they did was in 1980, Congress appointed the USDA as the lead agency on American nutrition. Coincidentally though, it had some of the same individuals that were on the American Heart Association Nutrition Committee. So what do you think the American government is going to recommend? They had the same minds on the American Heart Association Nutrition Committee making the same recommendations for them for their own dietary goals. So in 1980, the USDA released their first ever publication of the dietary guidelines for Americans. This would soon become known as the ever popular Food Pyramid in the 1990s and more recently, My Plate in the 2000s. Despite all the evidence that suggested that dietary cholesterol was not a problem, all the research that was done on humans, even by Ancel Keys himself, who was on the American Heart Association Nutrition Committee, despite all that research that was done, the USDA dietary guidelines went on to say to limit dietary cholesterol as much as possible. So over the following years since 1980, this is the pivotal moment in human history where things now became marketed as cholesterol-free, low cholesterol, fat-free, and low fat. Coincidentally, 1980 is also when obesity, type 2 diabetes, dementia, and other chronic diseases really began skyrocketing. It's just a really weird coincidence. We really started upping our carbohydrate consumption to 55 to 60% of our total calories and lowered our meat consumption, lowered our animal fat consumption, and all of a sudden, all these other virtually unknown chronic health conditions started arising. But now fast forward from 1980 to 1992, there might just be justice for dietary cholesterol. It might be vindicated once and for all. In 1992, the largest study ever conducted on this subject was released in a very prestigious medical journal, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. This study was titled Effects of Dietary Cholesterol on Serum Cholesterol, a Meta-Analysis and Review. Authors looked at every study on this subject. Does dietary cholesterol impact your blood, your serum cholesterol, your total cholesterol? And what they found is for the overwhelming vast majority of individuals, dietary cholesterol from red meat, butter, egg yolks has no impact on total blood cholesterol levels. So immediately, countries started following suit and removing any limitations on consuming dietary cholesterol. Virtually, you could consume as much cholesterol as you wanted and it made no difference. However, that same year in 1992, that's when the food guide pyramid was launched. And in that food guide pyramid, it advised Americans to continue to lower dietary cholesterol even more, even though this meta-analysis had just shown that it was not problematic. Our own government kept advising us to lower it even more. Until 2015, when the USDA finally released another report of their dietary guidelines for Americans. In that report, it was buried on page 91 of the 572-page report. And they quietly announced in one line, cholesterol is not a nutrient of concern for overconsumption. And just like that, with that one line, they essentially backtracked on everything they have been recommending for the past 60 years. However, you can go up and down any aisle of your grocery store today, and you will still see products labeled cholesterol-free or low cholesterol, fat-free, low fat. It gives you and I, the consumer, the impression that eating cholesterol is still a problem. And to individuals out there that don't have any formal nutrition education, this type of marketing can easily fool them into thinking that that is a health food, when usually foods that are labeled low cholesterol or fat-free are typically foods that are higher in sugar, higher in refined carbs, higher in man-made chemicals, higher in foods that are going to cause a lot of metabolic dysfunction, and foods that contain virtually no nutrition in them. Throughout this entire history, you can see how animal foods like red meat, butter, and egg yolks have been wrongly vilified for a few generations. About 100 to 150 years, they've been wrongly vilified. And more recently, in the past 70 years, is really when we started to see staggering rates of chronic illnesses, because we are trying to treat symptoms rather than treat the root cause. Because as you've learned, animal products are not the cause. There are even many cultures that eat high amounts of animal products with very little rates of chronic disease. The first example is a pretty cool story about Vilhjalmur Stefansson. He lived with the Inuits in the Canadian Arctic in the early 1900s. He lived with them for years and found they ate a diet primarily of about 70 to 80% fat. And this all came from animal fats, because what do you have in the Canadian Arctic? You don't have very many, if any, plants growing in that area. He recorded this in his book, Not by Bread Alone. And what he found and what he recorded in his work with them, that they lived long, healthy lives free of modern day diseases. Even when he returned back to the States in 1928, after living with the Inuits for years, he came home and wanted to conduct an experiment, a very controlled experiment. So he checked himself into Bellevue Hospital in New York City, and he was under strict supervision by the medical staff. What he did was, for a year in this hospital, he ate nothing but meat and water. That's all he did. And at the end of the year, the medical staff found that he was in perfect health. He had no nutritional deficiencies. He even continued to eat this way for the rest of his life because of how good he felt, he said. And he died at age 82 in perfect health. Now, the second example is with George Mann. He's a doctor and a professor of biochemistry. What he did was, in the 1960s, he traveled to Kenya, where he studied the Maasai. This is a traditional culture tribe that has been really living and thriving off of meat, organs, blood, and milk. A very high animal-based diet. Now, this was in the 1960s when all that science was going on. And so, knowing that there was an epidemic of heart disease going on in the world around him, in the Western world, where hundreds of thousands of individuals were dying from heart disease, and meat and animal fats were the culprit, or seemingly the culprit behind these issues, he found an entirely different phenomenon going on in the Eastern world. He found that the Maasai people ate meat, milk, and blood, and that's all they lived off of. But they had very low serum total cholesterol numbers. It's interesting to note. They would also drink 2 to 7 liters of milk per day and a half pound of butter fat. No vegetables were eaten because they wanted to save them for the cows. What he did was, he tested their blood pressure and their weight, and what he found is their blood pressure and their weight was 50% lower than the average American. And interestingly, this number didn't rise with age. The older they got, they still had lower numbers of weight and blood pressure. He even conducted EKGs on over 400 men and couldn't find a single case of heart disease. To go one step further, he performed autopsies on 50 Maasai men and only found one case where a heart attack may have occurred. So what he had determined from his visit is that contrary to popular belief, it wasn't normal for humans to have rising blood pressure, rising weight, and rising cholesterol levels as a normal part of human aging. Now, to summarize George Mann's point here with a little bit more concrete evidence, there was a review of 26 papers studying various traditional cultures, and the authors concluded that when individuals live in more primitive conditions, quote, an increase in blood pressure was not a part of the normal aging process. So it would seem that whatever we're doing here in the Western world and more civilized societies is what's causing all the health issues that we're experiencing. And it just so happens that meat consumption, red meat consumption, because it's a part of our human history of what we've been doing for a very long time, it's associated with all these chronic health conditions that we're experiencing. Whereas the true culprits behind modern day diseases, as the evidence suggests, ultra-processed foods, sedentary behavior, lack of sleep, high chronic stress, and avoiding the sun, these are all the culprits for causing modern day disease. Now, another example of humans eating a relatively high meat-based diet without getting chronic disease, this is the Native Americans living in the Southwest. They were observed during the years 1898 and 1905. They were found to predominantly eat a diet that was high in buffalo meat. That is until they were forced out of their traditional way of living. Now, what's interesting to note about these Native Americans is that according to our own 1900 US Census in America, Native American men lived to be 224 per million, whereas Native American women were 254 per million, compared to American men that were 3 per million, and American women 6 per million. Those rates are staggering. It was also noted in this report that none of these Native Americans were reported to have dementia, and they were all but free of chronic disease. While there are many factors that come into play here that could cause their good health, if they were eating meat-heavy diets, we can say for certain that eating a meat-heavy diet didn't cause any poor health outcomes in these Native Americans. But what about an example in America, in modern day America? Well, made popular by Malcolm Gladwell in his New York Times bestseller Outliers, he details the story of an Italian population living in Risotto, Pennsylvania. Shout out to my home state, Pennsylvania. This was conducted during the years 1955 to 1961, so right there during that prime age of all this research being conducted. Researchers found during this time that this population in Risotto, Pennsylvania stuck to their traditional ways of living, and they ate a high percentage of their diet coming from animal fats like tallow and lard, pemmican, and a lot of red meat. And what researchers found is they had strikingly low numbers of death from heart disease. That was compared to their neighboring towns that had higher rates of heart disease. So was there something special about them and their genetics that just caused this? Or did it show that a traditional diet, if you stuck to your roots and gave your body what it expected, and you avoided seed oils, and you avoided modern day unhealthy habits, you would be all but free of chronic disease? As I wrap up this video, you might be thinking, well, Craig, how about I just avoid cholesterol just to be safe? Well, there's not one diet that is right for everybody. But as the science shows, eating red meat, butter, animal products, egg yolks, these are not harmful to human health. Now, again, this is individualized across the board. What's right for me might not be right for you. But just taking a step back here and looking, the benefits of cholesterol. Cholesterol has so many unique benefits that it's in almost every single one of our cells, because nearly all of our cells require cholesterol for proper structure and proper cellular communication. You see, cholesterol forms part of the phospholipid membrane. It's a big word, big phrase, but it's just the structure of our cells. Cholesterol forms part of that in nearly every cell in the body, especially the brain. Cholesterol is also needed to make the hormone pregnenolone. This is important because this turns into cortisol, which is very important, testosterone, progesterone, DHEA, estrogen, vitamin D3, and more. Cholesterol is super vital for creating our hormones, our sex hormones. We don't want to lower our cholesterol just for the sake of maybe reducing our risk of heart disease, which has never been proven. And maybe one of the most important functions of cholesterol, it's important for our brain function and myelin formation. Myelin are important for our synaptic impulses. So all the communication from your brain cells to one another, this is important because if these deteriorate, this has been associated with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, other forms of dementia, MS, multiple sclerosis, and many other chronic diseases. So having enough cholesterol in our brains as we age is super, super important. Not to mention, cholesterol is also converted into bile acids in your liver, which then helps us to digest dietary fats and absorb fat-soluble vitamins, vitamins A, D, E, and K2. So cholesterol plays a very important role in our overall health. It's been wrongly vilified throughout the past 100 years, and as you can see throughout time, animal fats, animal proteins, animal foods, eggs, butter, red meat have been a very important part of our human diet throughout time. So if you enjoyed this video, we'd appreciate it if you followed us on Instagram at Ancestral Supplements, on Facebook at Ancestral Supplements, on all the popular social media channels. If you got something valuable out of this, let us know your favorite takeaway in the comment section below. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us and share this out with somebody that you know needs to eat a steak the most. I appreciate you being here. Talk to you next time.